Though his name is not attached to the phrase like his eponymous gun, Anton Chekhov is also frequently credited with popularizing the advice show don't tell that many young creatives get hammered into their skull. Quote, "Don't tell me that the moon is shining. Show me the glint of light on broken glass." End quote. While I don't necessarily disagree with this advice, it has created in my mind an interesting problem. What if for you, there is no moon? What if there has never been a moon? Everyone swears there's a moon, but you've never seen it, and honestly, based on the way that everyone else talks about it, you don't really feel the need to see it. In other words, in writing, how does one go about showing a lack? And perhaps more specific, how does one show that lack without framing it as a hole meant to be filled? This, I believe, is the question at the heart of representing asexuality and aromanticism in games. Beyond personal questions of representation, video game academics seem to be similarly enamored yet haunted by the show-don't-tell ideology, as perhaps exemplified by the narratologist versus ludologist debates that characterize the burgeoning years of games as an academic field. As emphasized by Henry Jenkins in his article, Game Design as Narrative Architecture, formal elements can and often do help to convey the stories of their games. Spaces can be designed to evoke familiar narratives. The environment itself can be put together in such a way as to imply a story beat, and when left to their own devices, players often invent their own narratives based on the actions taken by characters. Ian Bogost in Persuasive Games further outlines how procedural elements of games can underscore a narrative message. In other words, how a player plays and experiences the game often conveys its narrative. Games that are able to achieve this ludonarrative harmony are often touted as exemplars of the narrative potentials available within video games, and therein lies the rub. If video game narratives can in part be defined by their formalistic elements, and the best ones are, how can a game make playable a lack? In an article titled, "Where's the Queerness in Games? Types of Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender, and Queer Content in Digital Games," authors Adrian Shaw and Elizaveta Friesem outline the criterion used to build an archive of games with LGBTQIA+ content. Among the most concrete of these criteria are the relationships found within games. Quote, "Much of the existing scholarship on LGBTQ representation in games focuses on relationship options in games that allow players to romance, have sex with, or marry NPCs." End quote. However, here again we run into an issue when it comes to asexuality and aromanticism. If most games convey a character's sexual or romantic orientation through the ability to romance and or have sex, what about those of us who don't do those things? This difficulty is reflected in Shaw and Friesem's archive. Of the 352 games compiled with 550 examples of LGBTQIA+ representatives, there are only 4 explicit asexuals and only 2 aromantics, with these identities only being made apparent through direct mention or through creator note. In an interview with Polygon recounted over Reddit, narrative designer for BioWare's Dragon Age Inquisition, David Geider, was asked whether the character Cole was asexual. Geider dismissed this interpretation, stating that for more, quote, complicated identities like asexuality, quote, "You can't just show it, you have to talk about it." So, is that it? Are asexuality and aromanticism so complicated that they're doomed to reverse the advice? Tell, don't show? Are they so complicated that they're unable to be rendered by the formalistic elements of a game? I don't believe so, or at the very least, they shouldn't be. Up until this point in the essay, I've somewhat avoided defining asexuality and aromanticism. This is partially because part of me, perhaps foolishly, believes that they're now recognizable enough terms to need no introduction. However, I know that's not the case. So, for the sake of clarity, asexuality is defined by the Asexuality, Visibility, and Education Network, or AVEN, as when a person, quote, experiences little to no sexual attraction, end quote. Aromanticism is defined by having, quote, little or no romantic feelings towards others, end quote. With these definitions in mind, I want to begin thinking about not only how asexuality and aromanticism can be represented ludically in games, but how their presence can help to fix some of the issues with gaming relationships. In order to do so, let's take a look at a game that, mechanically, punishes you for role-playing your character as Aro or Ace. Fire Emblem Awakening was released in Japan on April 19, 2012, in North America on February 4, 2013, and in Europe and Australia on April 19, 2013. The game was a Hail Mary for the franchise, meant to be a send-off for the series after dwindling interest in Japan and having never caught on in the West. However, after selling 2.35 million copies worldwide, the game not only saved the franchise, but cemented itself as the new formula for Fire Emblem games for many years to come. And what was that formula exactly? Well, if you ask some people, it's a turn-based tactical RPG featuring a somewhat customizable player insert and a cast of colorful and dynamic characters saving fantastical worlds from equally fantastical evils. If you ask other people, it's a dating sim that just happens to have a really fleshed out turn-based tactical RPG side game. The quote-unquote dating sim aspect of the game is known as a support system. While Awakening was far from the first Fire Emblem game to have the support system, it was the first game to make the system as prevalent in both gameplay and story. In Awakening, when certain characters stand next to each other or are paired up into one unit, they're able to support each other in battle. This support comes in the form of both bonuses to stats, specifically those dealing in hit, crit, and evasion chance, as well as bonus actions, such as the occasional extra hit or a character blocking an attack for another. For each battle fought with each other, the characters gain support points. These points eventually level up the character support rank. Supports are ranked none or unsupported through S support, with each rung on the ladder increasing the stat buffs and likelihood of bonus actions, as well as unlocking the corresponding support conversation between the two characters. C through A support conversations are, for the most part, entirely platonic, with the final S support conversation resulting in a love confession between the two characters, with the implication of marriage in the future. Characters can support as many characters as they are able, but can only reach S support with one other opposite-gendered character. Supports in Awakening are, to put it bluntly, absolutely busted. In a tactical turn-based game, being able to control the terms of engagement is key. Awakening's map design is somewhat notorious for its bottlenecks, so being able to place two units next to each other to block off access to your more vulnerable range units is strategic. The fact that these two units can now be even more efficient simply due to the fact that they're standing next to each other while being married is game-breaking. Further, the bonus actions Dual Strike and Dual Guard can, at points, make the game trivial. Proc rates for these bonuses are calculated by adding the two supported units' skill stats together, dividing that by 4, and then adding a flat modifier dependent on the support level. S supports have a modifier of 60, so without even doing the stat calculations, you're now dual striking more than half the time, doubling your damage. Thus, in making S supports so advantageous, Fire Emblem Awakening has ludicrously reinforced the idea that romantic relationships are superior to platonic ones. In a game series focused on strategy and optimization, not only are players practically forced to be hetero-alloromantic, or one who experiences romantic attraction to someone of the opposite gender, but all characters are forced to be hetero-alloromantic if one wishes to play the game at the highest level possible. Well, okay, they got married, but that still leaves room for one to perhaps interpret these relationships to be romantic but asexual, right? No, not even a little. The story of Awakening revolves around the children of your current army time-traveling to the past in order to help their parents defeat the evil fell dragon Grima. After Chapter 13, each time one of your female units reaches an S rank with a male unit, an extra chapter is unlocked where you're able to recruit the child of those characters. Once again, this incentivizes hetero-allosexuality, or feeling sexual attraction to someone of the opposite gender, for a variety of reasons that become quite grim when analyzed. First, experience is precious in Fire Emblem. With a limited amount of chapters within the games and enemies that quickly ramp up in difficulty, the ability to access more chapters and thus EXP is invaluable. Furthermore, units are finite. If one was to lose any of their characters to death, they cannot be replaced. On higher difficulties, armies can quickly become overrun if too many characters are lost. Thus, being able to recruit new units to bolster ranks and add diversity to the classes of troops is incredibly advantageous. Finally, these child units are, for all intents and purposes, upgrades of their parents. All characters have growth rates that determine the likelihood of a specific stat growing with each level increase. These stat growths usually help to determine which unit a character is best suited for. For example, you wouldn't want a unit who has high magic stat growth rate to be a barbarian, unable to make use of tomes and thus the best stat the character has. Child units are the same. However, unlike their adult counterparts, child units' growth rates are in part determined by who their parents are. Thus, players are not just incentivized to pair up all their units into romances, but are pushed to make those romances as strategically productive as possible. Making use of the last example, if the child unit is a barbarian, the player would make sure the father of that unit wasn't a magic user, as that could skew the stat growths in a disadvantageous way. Thus, Fire Emblem Awakening not only makes essential hetero-allosexual and alloromantic relationships, but in doing so incentivizes players to procedurally practice what amounts to romantic eugenics. There are relationships that stat-wise are incorrect. Some relationships are just flat out better than others. Thus, romance and sex have not just been made necessary and strategic, but have been turned into something that can be optimized. While introducing a relationship system that is inclusive of asexual and aromanticism would not completely fix all of these issues, it would help to alleviate the commodification of romance and sex, particularly in the case of this game. If, for instance, S rank was defined simply as the highest level of trust between two characters rather than necessarily indicating a romantic or sexual relationship, this would have the benefit of ludicrously leveling the playing field between platonic, romantic, and sexual relationships. This would allow for new strategic support pairs that would have been previously disadvantageous due to the enforced hetero-alloromantic allosexuality. It would also mend the hole, that is, the lack of same-sex platonic friendships, would make the friendship between male and female characters not just a prerequisite for romance and sex, all while simultaneously disentangling strategically best from interromantic and sexual relationship. Players would still more than likely utilize this system to create the most powerful army possible, but now this army could theoretically contain straight and queer married couples, close friends, and queer platonic relationships. Sexually reproductive hetero-romantic relationships would no longer be naturalized nor framed as mechanically superior. While the shift in framing is small, it provides an inroads to aromantic and asexuals to see themselves and their relationships not just represented, but held to the same value as those that are normally considered to be conventional. Unlike other identities, asexuality and aromanticism suffer from a lack of legibility. It is a frequent story within the aro and ace community, the story of feeling confused, out of place, lost, and even broken. Romance and sex are so often framed as inherently human that the lack of these feelings is characterized as a lack of humanity. In rendering asexuality and aromanticism ludicrously in games, these identities become not only more visible, more recognizable, but are finally shown to be viable. Because having a lack doesn't make one less.